Kharkov, but it was very lightly defended. They only had 2,000 men up there. And the Ukrainians were told by us, because we began providing them with satellite intelligence.
How's this line called?
Well, it's just south of Kharkov. And it was just a plain right up to the river on the border with Russia. And we said, go ahead and attack that. And the commander said to President Putin, let him have it. It doesn't matter right now. We need to consolidate our position. Then we need to become impregnable. And when we've consolidated our position, our defenses are impregnable, then we launch offensives and we move out of them. Effectively, a repetition of Kursk from the Russian standpoint. And the Ukrainians were then invited to do what? Attack.
Yeah.
And we were stupid enough to tell them to attack. And what the Russians have proven and demonstrated, something they understood since the 70s, was the criticality of linking all of the overhead, space-based and terrestrial surveillance, unmanned and manned, drones, satellites, everything, with all of the standoff attack systems, rocket artillery, conventional artillery, tactical ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, everything.
Let's get into that.
And when that was linked, then we didn't seem to appreciate the lethality of that system. I call it in my book, Margin of Victory, and previously in my previous book in 2003, Transformation Under Fire, I call it the ISR strike complex. And I said we have to integrate ground forces, maneuver, and logistics within this larger ISR strike complex. We have to go all the way back to Ogarkov in the 19th.
Yeah, that's the ISR is intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance.
And he talked about the recon strike platform in space that will allow them to target and destroy anything on the planet. Of course, they didn't have the technology. And so this was conceptual, but he was right. And that's what you see emerge in eastern Ukraine.
Let's get back to this moment. It's a decisive moment in June when his generals say, well, this is something different, and then we have to change course. Is it then they're starting to build those defense lines, huge defense lines? Is it Zulubikin? Yes, Zulubikin. Yeah, that was the Zulubikin line. Yeah, that's the name I was looking for.
And he did a brilliant job.
Yeah, he did a brilliant job. Making those lines in Ukraine. So they built for months on the defensive side. Right. Because they knew that this was going to be a long and a hard battle.
And then he brings up additional reserves. Remember, it was initially 300,000. Then you got another 100,000. Now we're looking at even more, hundreds of thousands.
Well, one of the things you mention in your book, there is, of course, this is a culture that is always, you can say, forms the context of an army. And of course, economy is a part of this culture. And I think one of the astonishing things that happened in the last 2 years is the way in which the economy of Russia was transformed, and especially the military capacity to build arms.
But there was also no drop in the Russian standard of living. In fact, the Russian standard of living has improved.
But how is it possible that you can make a shift in such a short time?
Well, first of all, we have to keep in mind that
were there's all the production plans of the 80s. What did they do?
The plans. I mean, there are lots of plans on the shelf that were never thrown away. One of the things that the Russians don't do is throw things away.
That's what I mean.
They keep everything.
The plans.
But it wasn't just plans. You had to have the factories there. The manufacturing base had to exist. It was there. It just hadn't been mobilized and utilized. And at the same time, the Russians were always very good, and I think the Germans were, but not as good as the Russians during the Second War, of taking lessons from the field back to the scientists and the engineers. And they would come up front and look at what was happening, and they would make the changes that were necessary to improve the system, weapons platform. The other thing is that organizationally, the force that came into Ukraine is different from the force you have today. They made prudent changes, and they changed their chain of command. We have the same structure in NATO that we had in 1944-45, with all these echelons of command and control. Slows down the decision-making process. It's very hard to maneuver and manipulate. One of the things I pointed out in the book was that Eisenhower, as Supreme Commander, had to fight with U.S. and British Air Force officers to get them to bomb certain things that were vital to the success of the Normandy invasion.
Okay.
Because their attitude was, it doesn't matter what you do, we're winning the war by flattening Germany.
That is one of the main points also in your book, also at the end, in the conclusion, in which you say, well, there has to be a unity of command.
And you see on the Russian side, and when I covered the battle, the destruction of Army Group Center in June and July of 1944, even though the real numbers that I found were interesting because they destroyed far fewer Germans than we thought, and the Germans managed to do far greater damage to the Soviets than was reported. And the funny thing was that I discovered that the Germans had sent over 100,000 men on leave because they knew exactly where the Russians were coming. They knew, oh, this Macgregor, forget it. It didn't work. The German soldiers in the field and the commanders in the field knew exactly what was coming, and Hitler refused to change dispositions. So they said, well, what's the point of losing hundreds of thousands? So they sent 100,000 on leave. So in the day of the attack, there are 110,000 German soldiers facing 1 million. That's it. So, but that's aside from the point. But what you have with Zukov, for instance, who's the overall commander of these fronts, he is able to summon 5,000 Soviet aircraft in the space of 15 minutes and hurl them at a concentration of German troops, which was enormously effective, successful, and destructive.
And you're saying that right now.
But look at Zukov versus Eisenhower.
Yeah.
Eisenhower has to argue with the Air Force. Zukov gives an order, and it all happens.
Never realized that.
Now that's what you saw with Surovikin.
But are you saying that Russia is exactly operating under this one command?
Yes.
Right now?
Now they are.
So
they have
the different services are.
Oh yes, they are absolutely integrated, and they are responsive. There is one man at every level who commands everything.
Commands everything.
Yeah. In other words, it's your level, whatever it is.
Yeah.
It may be 15,000, 20,000, 80,000, whatever it turns out to be. He commands everything, all the air forces. And here's a good example.
But how's it?